In this video, we're going to create a devil Halloween costume inspired by one of the Versace 2022 runway looks. For this project, we're going to need thread, a ruler, scissors, pen, hooks and eyes, pins, measuring tape, some see-through paper, some muslin fabric, some zap straps, some tape, and some red fabric. I went with a non-stretch, but you could use a stretch if that's all you have. We're going to start by marking out the lines of our corset with our tape on our mannequin. It really helps for a project like this to have a reference photo or a drawing that you can continue looking back on. We're now going to move on to using our test fabric. Of course, if you don't have time because this is a Halloween costume, you could go straight to your regular fabric. The purpose here is to mark out all the lines that you just put on your mannequin onto your fabric. You're then going to cut out these pieces, leaving some seam allowance around the lines you just drew. With all these pieces now cut out, I'm going to repin them onto my mannequin and make any adjustments that I see fit. Marking all your pieces out at this stage will help make the next steps easier. Then, if you made any adjustments during this repinning, you can mark those down onto your fabric. This step will be skipped if you're going straight to the red fabric. Now you're ready to transfer all your corset pattern pieces onto your paper. This is where it helps if your paper is a little more see-through. So you can pin your pieces down and then mark the lines with a pen. This is where I like to use a ruler so that all the markings that I'm transferring have a smooth line to them. And then I'm going to mark a 1 centimeter seam allowance along all these lines, and then cut out my pattern piece. Again, making sure to mark on the piece which pattern piece this is. And you can do this with numbers or with words, whatever is going to help you remember. And then you're going to do these same steps for all 6 of your pieces. If your paper is not see-through, you can also cut out your pattern piece from your fabric, leaving no seam allowance. Place it on top of the paper and then mark it out from there. And then you can add seam allowance after. If you don't have paper, you can also mark out your seam allowance onto your piece of fabric and then transfer this piece of fabric straight onto your fabric that you'll actually be using and use the piece of fabric as your pattern piece instead of the paper. You're then going to use your fabric pattern or your paper pattern to cut out 4 pieces in your real fabric. And you're going to do that again for all 6 of your pieces. And the reason we're cutting out 4 pieces is because we need 2 layers for our corset. If you're cutting your pattern out of a fabric that has a wrong side, you want to make sure to mirror 2 of your 4 pieces. And by mirrored, I mean cut your fabric twice with the right side facing up and twice with the right side facing down. You'll see that the 2 right side pieces facing down will act as the other side of the corset. And now you have 4 of all 6 of your pattern pieces for the corset cut out of your real fabric. 2 of the pieces are normal and 2 are mirrored. So we're going to start by pinning the right sides together of half of our corset with the normal pieces, and then we're going to pin half of our corset with the mirrored pieces. I marked M for the mirrored pieces, and I hope this diagram helps a little. So we're going to attach our mirrored piece 1 to our piece 1, again placing right sides together. And then with everything all pinned, we're going to do the exact same for the second layer of our corset. And then with everything all pinned, we're ready to sew along all those seams. I sewed with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. And then I'm going to iron out all the seams of both of the layers of my corset. And then I'm going to place right sides together of these 2 layers. And then sew them together just at the 2 ends. So again, placing right sides together, we're going to sew the 2 ends of the corset. With these 2 pieces now attached, we can flip them right side out and cut away all the excess threads. We're then going to place pins to help align all the seams. Make sure that the pins are placed in the seam on both sides. Aligning all these seams will help for our top stitch. When sewing the top stitch, we want to make sure that we're leaving enough room to insert our boning, or in this case, the zap strap. So I'm going to do 1 stitch in the seam, and then I'm going to do 1 stitch right beside the seam. Again, making sure to leave enough space to insert our boning. When doing a top stitch, I really like to use my presser foot to help me with the placement of my stitch. And then my last stitch, I'm going to do a stitch on the edge as well because I'd like to put a piece of boning on each end of the corset. We can then trim away all the excess threads and measure the top of the corset to create our binding. We want to leave a 1 cm seam allowance on each end of this strip. So now with that measurement, we're ready to cut our binding. If you have enough fabric, it's really important to cut this piece on the diagonal. I didn't, but if you do, to cut it on the bias will make it way easier to use. We're then going to do the same process, measuring and cutting a bias strip for the bottom of the corset. Now with these two strips, we're ready to attach them to the corset. So I'm going to start with the bottom and placing right sides together and folding over the 1 cm seam allowance, I'm going to pin it along the corset. If pinning it is a little tricky, you can also just sew it without pins, making sure that your fabric lines up. And then on the other end, you're going to again fold over your 1 cm seam allowance. The width of the bias strip needs to be thick enough that you can fold it over twice. Mine was a little thick, so I trimmed it down before pinning it. So now I'm going to fold it over twice, tucking in the raw edge and pinning it in the seam on the right side of the fabric, making sure that I'm catching all the layers of the bias strip on the wrong side of the fabric. And then I'm going to sew along where I just pinned, making sure that my stitch is going in the seam. This technique helps to avoid seeing the new stitch. We're now ready to insert and cut our boning. If you don't have wire cutters, you should be able to just use scissors because the zap straps aren't too thick to cut. It is important that you added the bottom bias strip first rather than the top because it makes it easier to insert the boning. And now we're going to attach the top bias strip, doing the exact same technique that we did for the bottom. And then again, same as the bottom, we're going to fold it over and pin it down. And then sew along where we pinned. The final step of our corset is to add our hook and eyes. I decided to add 5 hooks and eyes, so I used my measuring tape to place them evenly. Then I placed pins on both sides to mark where I was going to sew them. And then using my hand sewing needle, I attached all my hooks and eyes. With the corset all done, we're now ready to make the dress. I'm going to start by draping the front piece of the dress by pinning it at the shoulders and at the side seams. And then keeping in mind seam allowance for the hem, I'm going to cut it to my desired length. And then with the other side seam pinned as well, I can roughly cut away that fabric. And then doing the same as with the front piece, I'm going to pin at the shoulders, at the side seams, and cut the length. If you don't feel comfortable draping, you should use your test fabric for this process as well. You can now cut the neckline and start trimming more and more away from the side seams and shoulders. You want to continue to adjust your pins and trim away your fabric until you get a shape that you like. We're now ready to add our 2 darts in the front. You can see how the corset fits at this stage, and remember to continue looking at your reference drawing. Once you like the placement of these, we can move on to the back. I'm going to start by pinning 2 centimeters down the center back of my dress. This excess is going to be used for the zipper. Whatever extra fabric is left over, I'm going to pin on either side, creating 2 darts. So now I have my back seam and all my darts pinned. This would be a good time to try it on and make sure that everything's fitting properly. And again, you can try it with the corset as well. With everything fitting well, we're going to take our back piece, fold it in half, and cut it down the middle. This is why we pinned the 2 centimeters down the center back. And this is where we're going to be placing the zipper. Then using our measuring tape, we can just make sure that our darts are equally placed before we sew them. And we can do the same for the front, measuring their distance and length. Then placing right sides together, we're going to pin at the shoulders and the side seams, and we're going to sew all of that with a straight stitch. So we're sewing all 4 darts, shoulders, and side seams. With all that sewn, we're now ready to attach our zipper. My zipper wasn't long enough, so I had to bring down the back a little bit. When doing the zipper at the back of a dress like this, the zipper always has to be long enough to reach the large hip, or the biggest part of the body. Before attaching the zipper, I'm going to sew my back seam with a basting stitch. So the largest stitch your machine will do. This will make it easier to attach the zipper and then remove later. I also like to sew the top of my zipper together because this creates less movement when I'm attaching it, and then I remove that later. And then with your dress inside out and the right side of your zipper down, you're going to pin your zipper into your seam allowance. And then with your zipper foot, you're going to sew your first stitch of attaching your zipper. Now with a seam ripper, you can unstitch your basting stitch from your back seam and cut the stitch that was connecting the top of your zipper. With your zipper now open, it'll be easier to get a closer stitch when you go over it again. We're now going to create our facing for around our neckline. This would have been easier to do before we attached our shoulder seams, but it's still possible to trace out an outline of our back and our front pieces with a 1 cm seam allowance. I typically like to make my facing between 5 and 10 centimeters wide. So you want to have 2 pieces for the back and then 1 piece for the front. And whatever width you decide to make for the facing, make sure that the 2 shoulder seams line up. And then placing right sides together, you're going to attach your 3 pieces of facing at the shoulder seams. Then placing right sides together, you're going to attach your facing to your dress. Make sure that for this step, you're aligning your shoulder seams. And then you're going to sew along where you placed your pins, including along the zipper. To get a crisper edge when you iron it, it'll help to do a top stitch along the inside of the facing. When doing this stitch, you want to make sure that you're locking in the raw edges on the back side of the fabric. So as you can see here, it's sewn really close to the edge on the side of the facing. This stitch will give you a crisper edge when ironing. We're now going to move on to the sleeves. Draping or creating a pattern for a sleeve can often be quite complicated. So I often like to just trace from a sleeve that I already have. You want to make sure that the armhole matches the armhole that you'll be tracing, and then you can just trace the sleeve with a 1 cm seam allowance. If you're unsure if your sleeve will fit, you can also cut out a little more than 1 cm seam allowance for a little extra fabric to play with. You're then going to cut 2 of these sleeves. And then folding right sides together, you're going to sew along the sleeve, and it also helps to sew a basting stitch at the top of the sleeve. This basting stitch will help fit the sleeve into the armhole. I then pin down my facings at the shoulder seams, which I'm going to stitch later, and then slightly pulled my basting stitch before inserting the sleeve. So with the dress inside out and the sleeves right side out, I'm going to attach the sleeve from the inside of the dress, pinning right sides together. And I'm going to pin all along the armhole. If your sleeve doesn't fit, you can always pull at the basting stitch to create more gathers or trim a little off the top of the sleeve. And then you're going to sew both sleeves along where you pinned. The final steps are to hem the sleeves and the bottom of your dress. So you're going to do this by folding it over twice and pinning it. It may help to iron this before you sew, and then you're just going to sew it with a straight stitch. And then you're going to do the exact same with the sleeves, folding them over twice, pinning, ironing, and then sewing where you pinned. The sleeves can be a little trickier because they're small, but you just have to take your time. The final step is optional because they're pretty easy to buy, but it's to recreate the devil horns. So you're first going to trace out the shape of the horn on your fabric, and then you're going to cut 4 of these out, remembering to leave a 1 cm seam allowance. You're then going to place them right sides together and sew 2 of the edges, leaving the bottom open. You're just going to sew this with a straight stitch with 1 cm seam allowance. You're then going to trim away the extra fabric around the point because it'll make for a crisper point when you flip them right side out. I then used some stuffing from an old pillow to fill up the horns. I made sure to leave enough fabric at the bottom that I was going to be able to sew it closed. I then sewed shut my 2 stuffed horns. Because of the extra fabric at the bottom, they were super easy to pin with hair clips or bobby pins. And you're all done! Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please subscribe.